It's the first week of July, and Blizzard has some important changes rolling out onto the War Within beta as we draw ever closer to the expansion's inevitable release. We're less than 2 months away at this point. So let's just start with the kind of big news of the week, the long overdue Shaman changes. I'm not going to go into huge detail about this because I'm not a Shaman expert anymore. I looked it up recently. I do have over 100 days played, but that was like more than a decade ago. But there was a good blue post here that summarizes things kind of nicely, and they've gotten a really important buff that I want to talk about, so let's take a look at that. So we'll just start with the post here. Kyvex saying, "Greetings, Shamans." All right, first things first, I have always thought that Shamans, plural, or the plural of Shaman was Shaman, so I looked it up. Wrong. I don't know why I had that incorrect information in my brain for like 15 years now, especially as an alleged shaman expert. I should have known how to pluralize the word. Anyways, earlier today we unfortunately deployed a small part of our shaman update to the beta. Strange sentence. This may have put the class into a bad state for testing, but then they fixed that today, so it's fine. So here's the real big deal. Sky Fury. Throughout Dragonflight and the War Within's development, the topic of raid buffs has been actively discussed, and we've come to the decision to add another raid buff, a new raid buff to the Shaman class. Our goal with this buff is for it to fully replace the Wind Fury totem buff previously brought by Enhancement Shamans, and grant elemental and restoration access to a raid buff to encourage their value in raids. Sky Fury incorporates the previous effect Wind Fury totem had of activating additional auto attack swings with a small mastery buff. Players may also note that this is lifting the party-wide restriction previously in place on Wind Fury totem's effect and turning it into a guaranteed raid-wide effect. Okay, I could talk about this for like forever, but the bottom line here is this is great, and this is probably the one example of raid buffs being really, really good and a thing that everybody likes. In terms of the actual mechanics of this, it's going to work exactly like Wind Fury Totem has. It's a 20% chance on auto attacks to do another auto attack. And so if you're playing a build that really gets a lot of value out of auto attacks, like Assassination Rogue, really just about any flavor of Rogue, or like Warrior, or Bear Druid, or just a lot of the classes that do stuff with their auto attacks, this winds up being a pretty huge boost. It's basically is just 20% more auto attacks. You also get 2% more mastery all the time as well, so that's not an insignificant buff, even for like, I don't know, classes that don't auto attack, mages or whatever. Harness the Fury of the Windlord to grant a target ally 2% mastery and empower their auto attacks to have a 20% chance to instantly strike again for 1 hour if the target's in your party or raid. You know, the typical party buff thing. If they're in your party or raid, everybody gets hit with it. And it's just a baseline skill you learn at level 17. Now, there's a lot of other stuff that's pretty cool for Shaman. There is one in particular that I really wanted to point out because I thought, oh wow, they're developing new vectors in griefing the tank. And it's this talent right here, new talent. Traveling Storms. Thunderstorm can now be cast on allies within 40 yards, reduces enemies' movement speed by 60%, and knocks enemies 25% further. So if you want to troll your tank, if you want to grief me, and you're playing a Shaman in a group, which, thanks to Sky Fury existing, you're probably going to have a lot easier time finding groups as a Shaman now, you can just target the tank, throw your Thunderstorm on them, and scatter adds in all different directions, and that's a really good way to make people unhappy. I'm so glad that they've put this into the game. Great. Now, with Traveling Storms aside, I do think that this Sky Fury buff is really awesome. You know, the frustration of having to argue as a protection warrior that yes, it actually is worth more damage for the raid for me to be in the Wind Fury group than for insert other DPS spec, Unholy DK or something. Like, that has been a real thorn in my side this entire expansion. Even before this expansion. So it's nice to just kind of have that go raid wide. It is just generally a buff for melee DPS. It's going to be better for all melee DPS across the board other than standard rep pallies who get no benefit out of Wind Fury Totem, and I think that might be it. I mean, Windwalker monks and Brewmaster monks ain't getting much out of Wind Fury Totem, but you know, non-zero amount of DPS increase. I think the only other spec that would truly get nothing is going to be Beast Mastery and Marksmanship Hunters. Will presumably still not get this because Auto Shot is technically a different skill from Auto Attacks, and so, right. This is great, though. I think this is really, really huge. I think everybody's going to be really happy about it. And the quality of life granted by having this be available from all three of the Shaman specs instead of just Enhancement is really freeing. It actually gives a reason to bring Elemental and Resto Shamans into groups that you normally would have felt like you're kind of griefing by having them there instead of some other superior spec. They now are able to justify their own existence. Good. Okay, now let's move over to class changes. There weren't a huge list of class changes here. Mainly they were just like some tuning changes for a couple of specs that really needed it, and we're gonna start right off the top here with Death Knight. The hero talent tree for Rider of the Apocalypse has gotten a small nerf for Frost and Unholy. You're not gonna get refunded runes, and that's fine. You get a little bit more damage with your Frost Strike and your Death Coil, I guess, but that's probably still worse just in general. That's okay, that tree is still in pretty good shape. Now, Sand Lane being nerfed for Unholy and Blood is predictable. It's kind of something I think that has been pretty well expected just from current raid testing and even like Mythic Plus testing. Blood Decay has really looked like it was kind of standing head and shoulders above the rest of the tanks, and a lot of that did have to do with the Sand Lane tree. Also, just the Blood Decay changes, the buffs that have occurred to the baseline class have really put them in a great state. But, you know, Sand Lane was really overperforming compared to all of the other hero spec trees for tanks. And so the Blood is Life accumulator will deal less damage in large scale AoE, and it can no longer crit. And just to show that off, the Blood is Life is this talent over here on the right hand side that makes it so that sometimes you will summon a Blood Beast, it'll store up some damage and then explode and do some damage. It does less damage in large AoE, and it can't crit. That's fine. That makes sense because you could crit to like fuel damage into it, so then having the chance to kind of double dip crit on top of a crit is definitely like a balance concern. Corrupted Blood ability of the Blood Beast also deals less damage, that's fine. Essence of the Blood Queen's haste, the main haste buff that you get out of the talent tree entirely, has been reduced from 1.5% per stack, so stacking up to 7.5%, and then going up to like, you know, pretty close to a Bloodlust when you have Vampiric Blood. That has been cut from 1.5% each stack to 1%, so that is a pretty substantial drop off in your haste value that you're getting out of this. You're basically getting 5% haste now all the time, and then 12.5% haste instead of like 25% haste during Vamp Blood, or 22% haste. You know, pretty significant drop in haste, but still puts Blood Decay, I think, in pretty good shape, as opposed to just being like fully dominant. You also just get less healing out of Vampiric Strike, and it deals less damage. Again, you know, it was basically the only tank that really like dealt damage, so by bringing them closer to the rest of the group, they then have a bit more freedom to kind of bring all of the rest of the tanks up basically just a blanket buff across the board to tanks after this nerf would probably be for the best. Tank damage is, you know, fallen a little bit behind compared to DPS damage, since all of the DPS trees are like very damage oriented, and the tank trees, hero spec trees, are maybe not quite as offensively minded. And then Infliction of Sorrow, the talent over here on the left-hand side that kind of gives you the increased bleed or disease stacking and then consumes your diseases to deal more damage. That has just gotten yet another nerf. And I mean, that makes sense, right? Like, it was very overtuned, and so it got a pretty big nerf, and now it's just gotten a little bit more of one. So Sand Lane has seen, I think, compared to the nerfs from the last couple of weeks, actually a fairly tame nerf here. I think they're still in pretty great shape. I kind of expected to see this set of nerfs once the expansion was already live. I'm maybe pleasantly surprised that they've already done this now. You know, before the beta is concluded and the game is out. They're actually trying to get this very overperforming hero spec for a very strong base class kind of under control. I think that's good, but it is a little surprising. There were some nerfs to Unholy damage just across the board, just a bunch of nerfs to Unholy damage. That kind of makes sense. Unholy's been really great, a little overperforming, so they're kind of bringing them back into line. Frost Decay has had some changes that are basically the opposite of that, basically just like some generic buffs to their damage in general, which also makes sense. Frost was definitely underperforming comparatively speaking, so they're kind of trying to bring the high performers down a little bit, bring the low performers up a little bit. Makes sense. And speaking of low performers, Elun's Chosen for Balance and Guardian Druid has just seen some very basic damage bonuses, just very basic damage buffs to that tree. It really isn't going to wind up being that huge of a damage buff for Balance Druid. I don't think it moves the needle for, you know, to be frank, Bear Druids are kind of worried right now. That is definitely the general vibe that I've gotten from friends who play Bear Druid, is that they're like looking around at other tanks and thinking, okay, what can I play that's actually going to get some changes? Because Bear Druid still hasn't gotten a single baseline change, and the current state of the class in Dragonflight not great. So if they are going to continue forward exactly as they are right now, but with hero talents slapped on the top, that's not really going to be a great situation for Bear Druids. And unfortunately, this set of changes, even though they're fine, and I think the Elun's Chosen Tree is like fun to play, I don't think they make it so that you go, oh, I was worried about playing Bear Druid and I was going to forsake my beloved main to just go play anything else. But now that they've got 25 or 10% more Moonfire damage, I'll definitely stick around. Like, that doesn't really do it for me. Now, there were some balance changes, just some kind of like some minor tweaks, some damage increases, a little bit more making Convoke a little bit more like offensively valuable as Feral, but as you can see, still no Guardian changes at all. Kind of a big bummer, actually. Again, of course, another wall of mage changes. Brewmaster Monks have gotten one tiny little nerf that I think is pretty justifiable. Actually, it's not that small, but, we'll show this off here. Elixir of Determination has been reduced to 50% of recently purified damage. It was just all purified damage, recently purified damage, and it is this talent right here. It's definitely one that you take in basically every situation. You get this at like, what does this require? Level 19 basically to pick this up. Not that you'd necessarily beeline to it, but when you fall below 40% health, you gain and absorb for 50% of your recently purified damage, or a minimum of 20% of your max health. So the minimum of 20% of your max health is still there. Your recently purified damage, has been some discussion about this recently. It seems like from testing that it is basically just your previous purify value. And so prior to this nerf, that was just 100% of your recent purify value, which is like, that's a pretty big shield sometimes. If you're taking a red stagger and you hit purify, that's pretty big. With that being cut in half, more likely than not in a lot of situations, it's just going to be that 20% of your max health, which on a 15-second cooldown and you fall below 40% of your health, you get a 20% of your max health shield. That's still buck wild. Even if the other value didn't exist at all, that's still great. So the fact that you can potentially be higher is still really good. I don't think that this is a problem at all for Brewmasters. I think they're great. Paladin has had Retribution Aura just completely removed. I think that's for the best. They'll tune the game about, people not having that occasional damage buff, and now you're not at a significant loss if for some reason you don't have two Paladins in the raid. I don't care about losing Ret Aura at all. Not interesting in the least. I'm fine with it. And then in the Ret Paladin tree, Expurgation has been made to last longer. That's good. Just a little bit more quality of life. They're trying to make Templar Strikes happen. Just stop, please. I don't like this talent. I think most people don't. Although with Wind Fury being raid-wide, maybe that is going to be the move for Ret Pally, since if you take Templar Strikes, you're able to... Templar Strikes being here, you're actually able to benefit from Wind Fury, whereas if you have Crusading Strikes, you're not able to benefit from Wind Fury. Still don't think I want to take Templar Strikes, but, I guess that's why they're trying to make it happen. If they buff it to the point where it does infinite damage, then eventually people will want to use it, even though, doesn't feel that great. A lot of Shaman changes. We're just going to slide by those. I'm happy for Shaman that they finally got their changes. Don't know that they're exactly what they were hoping for, but, they got some stuff that's good, I'm sure. And then, as you can see, no real Prot Warrior changes. Fury Warrior did get some a pretty significant set of buffs actually last week, including 30% more overall damage, but that evidently wasn't enough. They've gotten several more rounds of buffs to individual skills. They're really, really pushing for the sort of Raging Blow spam playstyle, which I have to say is probably my least favorite playstyle of Fury Warrior that's ever existed. Like, really proccing and reproccing Raging Blow cooldown resets. I really don't love that. I really prefer more of the Bloodthirst playstyle. And as you can see, Bloodthirst and Odin's Fury damage reduced. So they're really, really pushing more for more Raging Blow spam. I like Rampage, Rampage damage being good and Raging Blow spam being kind of the approach. And then just a lot less emphasis on Bloodthirst and Odin's Fury. Kind of a bummer to me. Really kind of disappointed a little bit with some of the direction that they're going with Fury Warrior, but I'm sure I'll still love it. I mean, I always have, I always will. So that is pretty much it for class changes. Not really that huge of a set of class changes, but there was one little thing that was found, data mined, shortly after the class changes went live, as you can see, like literally just a few minutes before I started recording this video. And that was a very small buff to Demon Hunter, and specifically to Vengeance Demon Hunter. And as we can see, it basically is, they've buffed this damage from 40% of your attack power to 41% for Infernal Strike, and then for like at bulk extraction. Instead of 30.9, it's 32.2. Basically, it is about a 4% damage increase for Vengeance Demon Hunter. Now you might think, who cares? And I would agree with you. That is a bizarre amount to buff them by. There's no functionality change at all. There is nothing except for a 4% more aura buff. Kind of a weird call. And finally, weirdly, Blizzard announced today at like 3 or 4 p.m. that they were going to be doing testing tomorrow. By the time you watch this, it'll be today. They're going to be doing this at 2. So under 24 hours in advance, they announced they're going to do an added day of testing, and it's going to be 3 bosses tested. Bit weird, bit of a pop quiz raid testing, which is kind of strange. You know, it's common to like criticize Blizzard and say, oh, you know, we're paying to be beta testers. I don't know. Usually when you get like a all hands on deck kind of meeting, you know, you're about to like be laid off or something. I don't think we're being laid off from testing the game, but it is definitely weird to have under 24 hours of notice for a pretty long raid test is kind of surprising. Okay, so that's it for this week's changes. I think the raid buff for Shaman is really amazing. It's actually a pretty significant bonus across the board for all melee builds, and that does include tanks. For the rage-based classes, so all Specs of Warrior and Bear Druid, it just feels really good to have Wind Fury Totem, so definitely more valuable for them than pretty much any other tanks or most other specs. I think Rogue is right in that range of being like very, very impactful as well. But just the fact that you won't have to fight to be in the Wind Fury group ever again, or like berate the enhancement Shaman in Mythic Plus that just refuses to take it, it's just a really good change for the game overall. I'm still strongly anti-raid buff, I want to be clear about that. I think the majority of them are very bad designs, very lazy, and not very interesting at all. Monk and Demon Hunter really are like the pinnacles of that. More damage, that's very boring, awful. But this one is fun and cool, and everyone is going to like having a Shaman around now, and that is good for the game. As for the other changes, I still think Blood DK is like, not just fine, but excellent. Bear Druids are starting to panic, and I think that's justifiable. They're really not all that bad, but nothing has changed for them, and that is a bit concerning considering where they're at right now in Dragonflight, kind of lower middle of the pack. Everything else seems like it's pretty much fine. We're all fine here. How are you? Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.